Hello, I'm Mark Neely, coming to you from my kitchen in Muncie, Indiana. And I'm really happy to be here on Poet Studio to talk about making comparisons and connections in poetry. And for me, that's what a lot of the pleasure of both reading and writing is about, is finding these connections between things that don't obviously go together. So one major example of this is the use of metaphor and simile, where two unlike things are brought together. And when I come across a really interesting metaphor, it's like I can feel the synapses in my brain really opening up. I know that's probably not neurologically sound, but that's what it feels like. Or as Emily Dickinson said, as if the top of my head were taken off. Depending on the poem, this kind of language can do a lot of different things. It can affect the tone, it can reflect the speaker's mood, it can convey information, it's going to change the sound, the form, and I think maybe most importantly, it provides a little jolt of surprise and curiosity for the reader. The best metaphors are like these little bombs full of sound and delight and information and surprise, but they're bombs. I mean, they have a bit of violence to them. They really force the reader to wake up, pay attention, maybe view things in a certain way. So I'll start by giving a few examples of what I think are interesting metaphors. The first one is from Bridget Begin Kelly's poem, Doing Laundry on Sunday. She's talking about tulips blooming in a garden, but she does so with this really sensual and startling metaphor. This is the beginning of the poem. So this is the Sabbath. The stillness in the garden, magnolias drying damp bells, petticoats over the porch rail, while bicycle wheels thrum and the full-breasted tulips open their pink blouses for the hands that press them first as bulbs into the earth. So that's really a really cool, inventive use of language, a really inventive way to talk about the garden, which is a pretty common thing that you see in poems. But I think the comparison is especially interesting because this is a Sunday poem. The first line is, "So this is the Sabbath." And those sort of lusty, sexy tulips add a bit of complexity, maybe a bit of scandal. They tell us something about all the beliefs and desires and urges that are competing for this speaker's attention. Something you might hear fiction writers talk about is the end of a story or the end of a novel is supposed to be surprising but inevitable. And I think that phrase also applies to this kind of language. In a metaphor, the tenor and vehicle have to be far enough apart to give the reader that jolt of surprise, but they can't be so far apart as to seem completely arbitrary either. And one of my favorite examples of this comes from Robert Lowell's poem, For the Union Dead, which starts like this. The old South Boston Aquarium stands in a Sahara of snow now. Sahara of snow. At first, those two things seem very far apart. Geographically, the Sahara is northern Africa, the snow is in Boston, North America. One's hot, one's cold. Etymologically, they're quite far apart. Sahara is an Arabic word. Snow comes from Old English. So there's a lot of things that distance them, but when you start to think about it, there's also many things they have in common. So both the desert and a blizzard are sort of this monochromatic landscape. They're dry, harsh. There's things blowing in the air. And I think importantly for Lowell, they're lonely landscapes and somewhat hostile to the human spirit. What makes this metaphor even more appropriate is the fact that we find out in the next lines that this aquarium is empty. The windows are boarded, the airy tanks are dry. And so the place is deserted. So that word desert sort of works itself into the bones of the poem. So that's one of my favorite examples of what at first seems like an unusual comparison, but turns out to be very rich and fruitful. While we're doing snow, here's a quick simile by a contemporary poet, Araceli Grimay, and this is from her poem, Consider the Hands That Write This Letter. Some beautiful thing I saw once, felt once, snow falling like rice flung from the giant's wedding. There's a much lighter mood to this than Sahara of Snow, I think. A wedding is presumably a happy occasion. These giants don't seem particularly menacing or anything. They just sort of recall that language of fairy tales. So, I think that's a good example of what you can do. Sort of, you've got the same literal thing, snow. And really, the rice from a wedding, it doesn't seem like as much of a blizzard as Sahara of Snow. It's a little lighter bit of snow, a little more joyful. So in these comparisons I mentioned so far, they're surprising, but there is a firm logic to them. It's pretty easy to break down, like here's the literal aspects, here's the figurative aspects. It's pretty easy to find those comparisons. But I'm also interested in metaphors that are a little bit wilder, a little bit less paraphrasable. And I think if you want wildness in poetry, Emily Dickinson is always a good place to go. So here's the beginning of one of her poems. The day came slow till 5 o'clock, then sprang before the hills like hindered rubies, or the light a sudden musket spills. So that's a little stranger. I mean, I don't even know what a hindered ruby is. I'm assuming it's like a flawed gem, it's a flawed ruby of some kind. And then to switch from that strange phrase to this musket, this war image, is just a very jarring transition. And, there's an actual gunshot in the poem, which is a poem that begins the day came slow. 3 lines later, you don't expect to have a gun going off. So that's one I love. Here's another kind of wild simile from Richard Brautigan. I got in and drove away like a flag made from 1,000 burning funeral parlors. There's something wonderful and energetic about that. It's sort of crazy, fiery, subversive. And you can see how that has a very different tone than something like the comparisons made by Robert Lowell or Bridget Kelly in their poems. So I think I'll finish up here by reading a poem of mine, which this connection comparison thing is sort of the heart of this poem. I think it's what holds this poem together. It's called Solomon's Wisdom, and it's about this speaker who's thinking back on a past relationship he had when he was young. And he's thinking particularly about this night when he and his partner were out during an ice storm. Solomon's Wisdom. Solomon's wisdom didn't keep him from pining for sleek horses. So how am I, with no direct warnings from above, to keep my mind off you in the bar mere 15 years ago? Ice pouring from the sky behind you, back when we still believed in winter, in benevolent bartenders and Peter Buck, believed no harm could come to us from drinking Bass with Bushmills and watching hipsters flaunt fake fur and silver by the orange space heaters until we were thrown out into a frozen park where the glassy trees reminded us of us, wrapped brightly in their misery. So it took a lot of time, a lot of drafts and revisions to get to this, but the key to me for finishing that poem was to find this one particular connection, which is the connection between the landscape, the setting, which is this ice storm. There's really a part of it is in a bar, part of it is in this park, but there's an ice storm, happening. And so between this ice storm and the trees in the park and the couple, and what I came to and what sort of ended the writing process of the poem and also ends the actual poem is that both the couple and the trees are wrapped brightly in their misery. So the trees are this beautiful, if you've ever walked around in an ice storm and seen trees encased in ice, it's really a beautiful thing, but obviously that ice is going to crack those branches and make the trees miserable. And for the couple, there's also an important link, I think, which is true of a lot of young relationships where beauty and misery seem somehow linked together. Also an important link in poetry. I mean, think of someone like Keats. So that to me was the key to finishing that poem, but there's a lot of other connections that are made. In the very beginning, the speaker compares himself to Solomon. It's said sort of in the middle of the poem, back when we believed in benevolent bartenders and Peter Buck. So Solomon believes in God. These two believe in Peter Buck. They believe in rock gods, I guess. And there are many other comparisons and connections throughout, probably several I haven't even thought about. And certainly even some of these I'm talking about were not things I consciously thought about when I was writing. Mostly they're things I recognized when I was revising and maybe pulled out a little bit. So the last thing I'll say before I sign off here is that these kind of connections are not just for poets, not just for writers. They're really crucial to every form of thought. Think of medicine. Some of the greatest advances in medicine really just had to do with someone making a connection between two things, mosquitoes and malaria, cholera and contaminated water. So these are things that affect, all kinds of thinking, and I think are really important for writers and non-writers to think about. So it's been fun. Go out there, think about the world, find the connections that mean something to you, and thanks for listening. Bye.